Did Jeremiah see our time coming? Why does his voice feel so sharp, so urgent, even now? And what if this ancient book is not only about collapse, but about a pattern inside God's plan? Most people remember Jeremiah as the prophet of tears and warnings, standing at the edge of national disaster. But the deeper question is whether his message is only historical or whether it reveals how judgment, mercy, and covenant fit together. But here's the thing. Jeremiah is not merely announcing doom. He is exposing a spiritual battle over truth itself, where real warning and comforting lies sound almost the same. Our thesis is simple. The book of Jeremiah may be one of the clearest biblical maps for understanding how God confronts rebellion, preserves a remnant, and prepares restoration through covenant promise. In this journey, we will trace Jeremiah's call and warning, the Babylonian exile as judgment, the new covenant promise, and the rise of false prophets and hidden deception, because these four threads seem to move as one story. Historically, Jeremiah prophesied in Judah during the final decades before Jerusalem fell to Babylon in the early 6th century BC, with key events often dated around 605 to 586 BC. His ministry unfolds under political pressure, temple confidence, and public denial, when many leaders wanted peace without repentance. Jeremiah's burden was not popularity, but fidelity. He warned that covenant unfaithfulness had consequences, not because God had abandoned his people, but because he was confronting what would destroy them from within. Then comes exile, not as random tragedy, but as moral and theological judgment. Yet even there, Jeremiah does not end in darkness. He speaks of a coming covenant written on the heart, a promise Christians later connect to Christ and the renewal of God's people across nations. This is where the mystery deepens. The same book that announces uprooting also whispers replanting, and running through all of it is the most unsettling theme, religious deception. Jeremiah repeatedly challenges prophets who promised quick peace when no peace was forming. That tension feels uncomfortably modern. How do we tell the difference between a word that heals and a word that numbs, between hope grounded in truth and hope manufactured to avoid obedience? So stay with me to the end, because Jeremiah may not hand us easy answers, but he gives us a lens. God's warnings are not the opposite of his love, and his discipline is not the end of his plan. If you have ever wondered whether judgment cancels mercy, Jeremiah answers with a trembling but stubborn no. Listen closely. The tears of this prophet may be the doorway to hope. If Jeremiah was only a tragic witness to Judah's final days, then his words belong to a museum. But if his book reveals a recurring pattern in how God deals with rebellion, then his voice is not trapped in the 6th century BC, it is standing in front of us. That is the tension we carry through this episode. Are we reading old ruins, or are we reading a map of judgment, mercy, covenant, and discernment that still explains how God works? The story begins with a call that Jeremiah did not seem eager to accept. In Jeremiah 1, he speaks like someone overwhelmed, not triumphant. He says he is too young, too unready for this burden. The divine response is not flattery, it is commission. He is appointed over nations and kingdoms, to pluck up and to pull down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. Notice the order. Demolition language comes first, restoration language comes last, and both belong to one mission. Can a prophet be both surgeon and alarm bell at the same time? Jeremiah's call is framed with images that feel almost cinematic. The almond branch, tied to watchfulness. The boiling pot from the north, tied to incoming disaster. These are not abstract symbols floating in air. They are warnings embedded in political reality. Assyria had weakened, Babylon was rising, and tiny Judah sat in a dangerous corridor between empires. Yet Jeremiah keeps pressing a deeper claim. Military pressure is real, but spiritual fracture is the core disease. External enemies are not the whole story. internal unfaithfulness is. That is why his warning sounds repetitive to modern ears. Return, turn back, do not trust in empty words. At first glance, it can feel like one sermon looped for decades, but the repetition is itself evidence of resistance. When a people are drifting, truth is often heard as noise. The prophet has to strike the same bell because the city keeps sleeping through the sound. He speaks in a place loaded with religious confidence. There is temple language everywhere. Sacrifices continue. Public rituals continue. Leaders speak in God's name. Yet Jeremiah dares to ask whether visible religion has become a shield against real repentance. In what many call the temple sermon, likely around the reign of Jehoiakim, he confronts the slogan that the temple guarantees safety. If God's house is treated like a talisman while justice collapses in daily life, then the ritual becomes a lie. Could sacred space itself become part of deception when the heart remains unchanged? This is where the main question sharpens. Jeremiah does not describe judgment as divine mood swings. He describes it as covenant consequence. The people are not random victims of history. They are covenant partners violating covenant terms. He repeatedly names social sins, oppression of the vulnerable, dishonesty, violence, and refusal to hear correction. So when catastrophe comes, it is not the failure of God's plan. It is one phase of God's plan, confronting rebellion without abandoning the covenant story. But here is where many viewers get stuck. If judgment is real, where is mercy? Jeremiah refuses to pick one side. He announces the sword, famine, and exile, but he also preserves language of future planting. He laments deeply, yet he keeps speaking hope under ash. This dual voice is why he is hard to domesticate. He is too severe for cheap optimism and too hopeful for final despair. His own life becomes part of the message. He is mocked, isolated, threatened, and at times imprisoned. He is told not to marry as a sign of the coming social collapse. He buys a field while the city is under siege as a sign that land and future are not over. Think about that image. While walls are falling, he signs a deed. While everyone can count the end, he acts out a beginning no one can yet see. Is that irrational faith or covenant realism? Even his emotional honesty is theological. The so-called confessions of Jeremiah reveal anger, sorrow, fatigue, and complaint before God. He does not perform unbroken strength. He argues, weeps, questions, and still returns to obedience. That matters for our thesis. Divine warning is not cold machinery. It passes through a human messenger who bleeds under the weight of truth. In Jeremiah, fidelity is not emotional numbness. It is wounded persistence. So the first pillar leaves us with a sober frame. Jeremiah's call and warning show that God confronts rebellion directly, not to erase his people, but to strip away illusions that would destroy them from within. Yet a warning only proves itself when history answers it. And history does answer, in fire and chains. That takes us to the exile. When Babylon appears in Jeremiah, it is not introduced as a random villain wandering onto the stage. It is often portrayed as an instrument of judgment, severe and frightening, but still under divine sovereignty. Around 605 BC, Babylon defeats Egypt at Carchemish, and the regional balance shifts dramatically. Judah becomes exposed. Over the following years, pressure increases, alliances fail, rebellions flare, and finally Jerusalem falls in 586 BC. The temple is burned, the monarchy collapses, elites are deported. For many, that looked like the end of the covenant itself. Yet Jeremiah had been saying for years that political strategy without repentance would not save them. Some leaders looked to Egypt. Some clung to royal ideology. Some trusted prophetic voices that promised quick reversal. Jeremiah's message cut across all of it. Do not confuse national survival with spiritual health. Do not call peace what God has not called peace. Do not mistake delay for cancellation. Here's what most people miss. Jeremiah's exile language is not just punitive, it is diagnostic. Exile exposes what was already true. Idolatry had hollowed covenant life. Injustice had become normal. Truth was traded for comforting speech. Exile makes hidden fractures visible. In that sense, judgment is revelation. It uncovers what denial kept buried. Still, Jeremiah never celebrates disaster. He weeps over it. The weeping prophet label can be simplistic, but there is something true in it. He grieves the city even when he knows the sentence is just. That combination is rare. He does not weaponize truth against people he hates. He mourns people he cannot flatter. Could this be one test of true prophetic witness, sorrow without compromise? The famous letter to the exiles in Jeremiah 29 deepens the pattern. Instead of promising immediate return, he tells them to build houses, plant gardens, seek the welfare of the city where they are carried. That is a long obedience in displacement. Judgment does not erase responsibility. Even in discipline, life must be cultivated. Even in foreign soil, faithfulness is possible. And in that same context appears one of the most quoted lines in modern Christian culture about plans for welfare and not for evil, to give a future and a hope. Detached from context, it sounds like instant encouragement. In context, it is spoken to exiles facing decades of waiting. Hope is real, but not cheap. Promise is real, but not immediate. That matters for our question. Jeremiah does not deny mercy. He relocates mercy inside a painful timeline. Exile also tests identity. Without temple access in the old form, without king in David's line actively ruling the land, what anchors the people? The crisis forces a deeper covenant reckoning. Are they God's people only when institutions stand, or also when institutions collapse? Jeremiah suggests the latter. The covenant story can survive the death of familiar structures because its author is still active. This is why the exile is judgment. Yes, but not annihilation. A remnant theme remains. Not everyone vanishes into silence. Memory is carried. Scriptures are remembered, copied, and interpreted in new conditions. Lament and hope coexist. The old confidence dies, but a purified dependence begins to emerge. If that pattern is enduring, then collapse may be the place where counterfeit certainty burns off, and truer trust is formed. For viewers today, this creates an uncomfortable mirror. We often ask whether God is present only in moments of visible blessing. Jeremiah asks a harder question. Can we recognize God's hand in correction, exposure, and loss without calling evil good? The book does not invite passivity toward suffering. It invites discernment about what suffering reveals. By the end of this pillar, one thing is clear. The fall of Jerusalem is not the cancellation of God's plan. It is one severe movement within it. Judgment confronts rebellion, but it also prepares the ground for a deeper restoration. And that restoration is not framed first as rebuilt walls. It is framed as rewritten hearts. Now we arrive at the promise that changes the horizon. In Jeremiah 31, amid words of return and rebuilding, we encounter a line that has echoed across centuries. God speaks of a new covenant, not like the covenant made when Israel came out of Egypt. The law will be written on hearts. God will be their God. They will be His people. Forgiveness is foregrounded. Knowledge of God is described as internal and widespread, not merely institutional. Pause there. Jeremiah does not say the old covenant was pointless. He says the relationship was broken by human unfaithfulness. The new covenant promise addresses that fracture at the level of interior transformation. This is not mere policy reform, it is moral and spiritual renovation. The crisis revealed that external commands, though holy, could be resisted by stubborn hearts. The promise now targets the heart itself. Within Christian interpretation, these lines are often connected to Jesus and the Last Supper language of the New Covenant, then further developed in writings like Hebrews. Jewish interpretations engage Jeremiah's promise in different theological frameworks, often tied to restoration, Torah faithfulness, and communal renewal. We should be careful not to flatten these traditions into one voice. But across readings, the passage is recognized as a pivot from shattered trust toward renewed covenant life. This matters for our thesis because it shows that divine discipline aims somewhere. If judgment were the final word, Jeremiah 31 would not exist. But it does exist, embedded in a book known for tears. The same prophet who announces uprooting announces planting. The same God who exposes sin promises forgiveness. The same narrative that descends into exile opens toward a future not manufactured by human strength. Notice also the emotional logic. People living through collapse need more than analysis. They need a reason to return. The New Covenant promise gives that reason. It says, your failure is not denied, but it is not absolute. Your history is not erased, but it is not your prison. Grace does not pretend there was no wound. Grace heals the wound without denying how deep it was. Could this be why Jeremiah still feels urgent? Because he refuses both extremes. He rejects the lie that sin has no consequence, and he rejects the lie that consequence means no future. In many religious debates, communities split into camps of harshness or softness. Jeremiah refuses the split. Truth and mercy are not enemies in his theology. They are sequential movements in one redemptive pattern. There is also a political edge here. If the heart must be rewritten, then no regime, priesthood, or reform program can finally save by itself. Institutions matter, teaching matters, leadership matters, but the covenant crisis runs deeper than administration. Jeremiah's promise decenters human control. Restoration is ultimately God's work, though it calls for human response. For a channel like ours, with a dark documentary tone, this is where mystery becomes hope without sentimentality. The darkness is not denied. Cities burn, families are displaced, prophets are rejected. But beneath that darkness runs a hidden current. God is not only ending a corrupt chapter, he is authoring a future chapter in which obedience is not only demanded but inwardly enabled. So when we ask whether Jeremiah is a key to understanding God's plan, the New Covenant section answers with force. Yes, because it reveals that judgment is not a dead end, it is a corridor. It leads from exposed rebellion to transformed belonging. Yet one threat keeps recurring in every stage of this story, and if we ignore it, we miss the warning entirely. The threat is not only external empire. It is internal deception, speaking in religious language. Jeremiah's conflict with false prophets is one of the most disturbing parts of the book, because the counterfeits do not look obviously evil. They use familiar words. They promise reassurance. They invoke God's name. They tell people what frightened hearts most want to hear. Peace is near. Crisis will pass quickly. The yoke will break soon. But Jeremiah keeps insisting that these words are not medicine. They are anesthesia. In Jeremiah 28, the clash with Hananiah is a striking example. Hananiah publicly predicts a quick end to Babylonian domination and breaks a yoke symbol to dramatize his message. Jeremiah initially responds with a wish that it were true. That detail is important. He's not addicted to bad news. He would welcome mercy. But wishful prophecy is not truth. The test is whether the word aligns with God's revealed direction and whether history confirms it. This raises a terrifying possibility. Religious speech can become a shield against repentance. If people are told that everything is fine while covenant life is collapsing, they will never turn. False comfort can be spiritually lethal because it removes urgency without removing danger. In that sense, deception is not a side issue in Jeremiah. It is central to why judgment became unavoidable. How then does Jeremiah teach discernment? Not by giving a simple formula, but by repeating patterns. True prophecy often wounds before it heals. It aligns with covenant ethics, not merely national optimism. It can stand against institutional pressure. It does not measure truth by popularity, and it is willing to be tested over time. False prophecy often does the opposite. It baptizes the status quo, avoids moral confrontation, and treats immediate relief as the supreme good. We should be careful here. Not every hopeful voice is false, and not every severe voice is true. Tone alone is not the test. Jeremiah himself carries both warning and promise. The issue is whether the message calls people into covenant fidelity or allows them to remain unchanged while feeling safe. This is where the episode's main dilemma becomes personal. In our own age, we also hear competing religious narratives. Some reduce faith to comfort management. Others reduce faith to permanent outrage. Jeremiah offers neither. He calls for repentance, endurance, and discernment under pressure, while refusing to surrender hope. If we only keep the hard parts, we become brittle. If we only keep the soothing parts, we become blind. There is even a hidden mercy in the exposure of false prophets. Once deception is named, people can choose again. Once counterfeit peace is unmasked, real peace can be sought. Jeremiah's confrontations are severe, but they are not pointless humiliation. They are rescue attempts aimed at a people drifting toward ruin with hymns on their lips. And yes, this should humble anyone who teaches, preaches, or speaks for God. Jeremiah does not let us weaponize his words against others without self-examination. The question is not only where false prophecy is out there. The question is where we prefer comforting lies over correcting truth in here. So what does the full arc now reveal? Jeremiah's call shows that warning is an act of covenant faithfulness. The exile shows that judgment can be historically concrete without being spiritually final. The new covenant promise shows that God's goal is inner renewal, not mere external compliance. The exposure of false prophets shows why discernment is essential if mercy is to be received rather than counterfeited. Taken together, these threads support the thesis we set at the beginning. Jeremiah is not a relic of doom. He is a theological map. God confronts rebellion, preserves a remnant, and opens restoration through covenant promise. Divine discipline and divine love are not opposites here. They are intertwined movements of one redemptive purpose. But the map only helps if we walk it. Will we hear warning as mercy before crisis hardens into collapse? Will we reject soothing words that require no repentance? Will we hold hope without denying judgment, and embrace judgment without denying hope? Those are not ancient questions only. They are present questions. If Jeremiah did see our time in any meaningful sense, it may be in this recurring pattern. People trust appearances. Truth is resisted. Crisis exposes what was hidden. God preserves what seems too fragile to survive. Promise rises where certainty died. And in the middle of all of it, the decisive battle is over whose voice we call peace. Hold that tension for what comes next. Because once you ask how to recognize a true word in a crowded religious world, you cannot unask it. And the next step is learning what that discernment looks like when the stakes are your own life. So where have we arrived? We began with a hard question. Is Jeremiah only a record of Judah's collapse, or a living pattern that still explains how God works through warning, judgment, covenant, and discernment? After walking through his call, the exile, the promise of a new covenant, and the exposure of false prophecy, the answer is clearer. Jeremiah is not frozen in the past. He reads like a theological map drawn in fire. First takeaway. Jeremiah's warnings were not proof of divine cruelty, but signs of covenant seriousness. He speaks as someone sent to name what everyone else wanted to hide. If sin is ignored, collapse eventually becomes visible. If truth is softened, deception grows in sacred language. That is why his voice sounds severe, not because love is absent, but because love refuses to lie. Second takeaway. The Babylonian exile was historical catastrophe, but not theological abandonment. Dates and sequences are generally placed around 605 to 586 BC, yet the deeper point is not a timeline alone. Exile reveals what rebellion had already done inside the nation. It strips false confidence, exposes spiritual fractures, and forces the question of identity when institutions fail. In Jeremiah's frame, judgment is real, but final despair is not. Third takeaway. The new covenant promise reframes the entire book. The God who tears down also plants. The God who disciplines also restores. The promise of law written on the heart, interpreted in distinct ways across traditions, signals that restoration is more than political recovery. It is inward renewal. This is why Jeremiah can hold sorrow and hope in the same breath without contradiction. And through all three takeaways, one thread keeps returning: discernment. False prophets did not always sound openly wicked. They sounded reassuring. They offered peace without repentance, confidence without transformation, relief without truth. Jeremiah insists that not every comforting message is healing. Some words numb what should awaken. That brings us back to the thesis we tested all the way through. Jeremiah is not merely a doom narrative. He traces a redemptive pattern where God confronts covenant unfaithfulness, unmasks deception, preserves a remnant, and opens a path to renewal. Divine warning and divine love are not enemies. In this book, they move together. So what do we do with that now? We resist two temptations. One is to weaponize judgment and forget mercy. The other is to preach mercy while editing out repentance. Jeremiah permits neither shortcut. He teaches that truth without hope crushes and hope without truth deceives. In a medium pastoral sense, maybe this is the quiet invitation. Let warning do its work before ruin does it louder. Let discipline be received as correction, not rejection. And when everything looks uprooted, remember that God can still be planting where we only see dust. If even part of this pattern is true, then Jeremiah is not asking us to fear the future. He is asking us to hear rightly in the present. Which voice leads to covenant faithfulness, and which voice only calms us while we drift? If this episode helped you see Jeremiah with fresh eyes, follow for the next descent, because the next question is darker than the last. When two voices both claim to speak for God, what test remains when comfort is no longer enough? Take a second. Based on what we uncovered today, answer this in the comments. Do you think God's warnings are judgment only, or mercy leading us back? And as always, God bless you.